Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Culture Clash, Driving Workplace Change and Transformation. So I'm pleased to welcome Libby Sartain, a true HR superstar, and currently Libby's impact is Libby's impact as a CHRO came in her working with Southwest Airlines and Yahoo. In both jobs, she led significant business transformation initiatives and served as a member of the executive leadership teams. Libby also led global HR efforts focusing on attracting, retaining, and developing employees. Today, Libby's focus is on growth companies, helping them develop an employment brand strategy while establishing a reputation as an employer of choice. As you will soon hear, Libby's really passionate about helping her clients transform their cultures through meaningful change. Hi, Libby. Welcome. We're here to talk about transforming workplace cultures. Employee engagement and culture change are hot-button issues today. But based on data, many employers seem to still struggle with those two issues. In basic terms, can you tell us why engagement and culture seem so difficult to enhance and improve? And can you narrow it down to 2 or 3 factors?
Sure, Tom. I think the first thing is that most companies say they give lip service to the fact that culture and people are our highest priority. But when it really comes to living those priorities out day in, day out, culture doesn't become the priority. And I think in order for it to be the priority, it has to be owned by the CEO and the team at the top, and that everyone in the company has to consider it a priority. It has to be systemic. It cannot be a top-down edict, and it has to become a way of life. And that is a day in and day out process that must truly be one of the top 2 or 3 priorities of an organization. And I don't think most organizations think and act that way.
Thanks, Libby. Along those lines, you mentioned that in the past you've said in your talks and in some articles that you've done that HR isn't responsible for culture. It can be a steward of culture and a catalyst, but culture must be owned by the entire workforce, especially the team at the top. Can you get more into those aspects of culture and why you believe those things to be true?
Yeah, first thing I would say is I've been on a couple of job interviews in the past, including an interview with one major airline that is known for its terrible culture. And the CEO has said, we want to hire you because we want you to transform our culture. And when I've said, well, how do you plan on doing that? And they say, we thought that would be up to you. I think that's when you should run for the hills. If someone thinks that HR itself can be responsible and own the culture. That doesn't mean you're not the catalyst. That doesn't mean you don't make it happen day in and day out. But if the organization looks at it like that's HR's responsibility, not mine, then it's not going to happen. So it's not an either or. It's kind of a cycle. It has to be a way of life, as I mentioned before. And so that means that everybody's values must be aligned with the values of the company, that everybody's behavior must be on brand and culturally within the culture. And that means that the leaders of everyday work are the most important aspect. Because, quite frankly, you can define a culture and you can stick values everywhere for people to read them. And HR can do a lot of things to make it come to life in learning and development. But if every coworker is the one that creates the experience that people have day in and day out, so everybody has to embrace that behavior and those values.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Libby, for that. This is a question that is short, but it can be complicated. It's a chicken and egg kind of situation. Many HR leaders, no doubt, struggle with it. Do you personally, from your experience, believe culture drives performance, or does performance drive culture? It's not a trick question, but I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
I don't think that's an either-or kind of situation. I think that if you have a high-performance culture, that will drive performance, obviously. But then having success success breeds success, so to speak. So when people see that, wow, this high-performance culture really develops results, results are very powerful and motivating, and so that kind of helps create a sustainable, replicating culture. Now, I think there's a big key in that effort, though. High performance that's not shared with the the employee population. There's got to be a "what's in it for me" kind of quotient there. So let's say in the case of Southwest Airlines, they have one of the longest-standing profit-sharing plans in the industry. I believe it was started in 1973. So when the company had great performance, which it did often, it shared its profits with employees. So profit sharing then made a lot of employees able to retire very well. So when people are seeing their fellow employees having great success from this high-performing culture, it becomes kind of easy to get in the groove and follow that culture.
That makes perfect sense. It's a good answer. It doesn't have to be one way or the other, but they feed off each other, so to speak. Yeah. Well, here's another thing. The
worst thing, just to add to that, is to have, and I've seen it happen. The CEO or HR or somebody comes and says, "This is what our culture is all about, and here's what we need to do for you as employees." And then it works, but then they don't come back and say, "Thank you, it worked, and here's what we're doing for you in return." And then, people don't believe that it's important if it's not shared back around.
Yeah, there's a certain element of not deception, but it certainly it doesn't work if you act that way as leaders of a company. Obviously, you're not going to get much success or buy-in by your employees and your workforce.
Right.
Okay, another point you've mentioned in the past is that hiring talent whose values match the company's values should be one of the top competencies for organizations seeking to build one of those high-performance cultures. Can you talk about that? I want to ask you, too, and when it terms of values, I guess that not every company, you're not subscribing every company has the same value, but the people you hire their values need to match what your values are for there to be a good outcome. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. I think the first thing is that I always get there'll probably be a question that if you hire people based on shared values, are you discriminating? And I don't think values have anything to do with the way people think, per se, but they have more to do with the way people behave. So what I'm talking about really is looking at the interview methodology that I like is behavioral-based interviews, where you really are taking your shared values and making sure someone's personal values are aligned with the values of the company and that they behave in the way that successful top performers in your company behave. So the way we did this at Southwest, for example, we started with flight attendants, and I always think you have to start small and build it out. But we took our 100, what our flight attendant leadership team would think, these are our 100 best flight attendants. If we could clone, we would. And then we interviewed those 100 flight attendants and their supervisors and their managers, and we identified what are the 6 to 8 attributes that are making those, how they behave, making those flight attendants our best. And then we interviewed people for those attributes and for a values cultural alignment with the company using hiring teams who have been trained to do that. And the teams would include peers, supervisors, a member of the HR team. And that produced this replicating workforce of people who have shared values, who behave in a consistent way, the way we want people to deliver on brand to our customers, and that takes a long time to get that going. But if you start somewhere and build, eventually your whole workforce will share those values and deliver on-brand behavior.
Well, that's very logical, and I think that makes plenty of sense. Hopefully our listeners will get some information from that they can take back to their organizations today.
Then
go ahead.
The second part, I would just say, the second part of that, I would just add to that. Once you hire somebody, though, the employee experience has to match the values and the desired behavior. So you have to really make sure that the candidate experience mirrors the cultural experiences that you want to have at work, and that the ways in which you offer people a job and get them onboarded, and then how they work is all aligned. Because if there's misalignment anywhere, we're back to your first question: why doesn't it work? Because you've hired me and you've told me how it is, and if it's not that way, then I become a skeptic or a cynic, and I vote with my feet, right, out the door.
Sure. Well, that makes good sense. And speaking of which, now we're talking about managers, particularly bad managers. And I know that people say people don't quit companies, they quit managers, bad managers. They really can be a problem in terms of achieving the things that you're talking about today when it comes to culture and engagement. And yet we continue to see that happening. Could you talk about how HR needs to manage these situations? And I know it isn't easy, I'm sure, but when a manager, I say, goes off script, or when it comes to companies' core values, isn't really following the ideas that you just laid out. In other words, how damaging are they, and what can HR do? How much impact can HR have on that particular problem within a culture?
Well, I think HR can have a strong impact, and this is where, when I say we don't own it, we don't, but we certainly become the catalyst and the agency that makes this all happen. But the first thing is in the selection of leaders. So just like we talked about the selection of employees, I believe that your first-level supervisor through your senior leader selection program has to be very much geared around what the leader believes, how it behaves, how the leader engages people, and how they reward. And I think that selection of leaders is the first part. But you make mistakes sometimes, and it's better if you're growing leaders from within. But I can think of a situation at Southwest where we hired a technical person with some technology that we really needed, and nobody in the company had that, and we hired the person from outside. And within a few weeks, we were hearing reports that this person is autocratic, threatening his workers, doesn't display the kind of behaviors that we look for. And, of course, at first you talk to the person and say, let's get you some help, let's get you a mentor. But if the behavior continues, you can't let it go on. And we terminated the person. And, it's funny how a couple of visible departures, when people aren't behaving, gets everybody else to come into line. And when we hired new supervisors or new managers, we had supervisor training programs and manager training programs. And if those people got out into the workforce and weren't managing, we might demote that person back to where they came from. And then everybody sees, oh, they're serious about it. But if you let the behavior continue, here come your cynics and your skeptics once again.
Well, that's a tough situation, I know, because, and anybody who's worked in an organization with a bad manager just knows how that can be such a poison across, even if it's within a small group, but you multiply it out, it's just disaster.
Your manager really creates, your manager, we talk about the employee experience so much right now. It's such a hot topic. And we can talk about all of the levers that HR has to create that experience. But the very first and most important the most important factor over that experience is that person's direct boss, because they really create that experience day in and day out. And if that boss is not exemplar of how you want people to be led, it's going to be not work.
Yeah. To expand on that question, I want to ask you this. How does improving your culture directly correlate to driving customer-facing success? Obviously, there's a relationship there. And when I say customer, I'm talking both internal and external, because not everyone faces with an external customer. But you know what I'm trying to get at? How important is that in terms of the bottom line? Even if it's internal, it's going to impact the bottom line, but especially with external customers.
So if you go back to the very first slide I had, culture is how work gets done in a company or how we behave day in and day out. So the way I look at the relationship and the very strong relationship between the customer experience and the employee experience is looking at the brand inside and out. So a company has a brand, what they stand for and what the big idea is and what they deliver to their customers. But then the people inside the company, it's not just employees, because in many cases, some of your work is delivered by people who are tangentially associated with your company, but they may not be on your payroll. They may work for someone else. But anybody who delivers on that customer experience needs to really connect to that big idea, understand what is expected to deliver and what kinds of behaviors are there to deliver, and then you as a worker, how that behavior and how delivering on that behavior helps them personally succeed. And ultimately, back to that question, what's in it for me as an employee? So if I deliver and the customers are happy, where are the rewards that I will receive to that connection? And if you think that you can promise an experience to your customers outside the company that's better than the experience you promise inside, that's a failure. One of the things that Herb Kelleher at Southwest was famous for was saying that our employees are customer number one. And people in the media would actually make fun of that, because at that time the customer was always first. But you got to stand behind your people, because they're the ones that make the customer feel first. So it's a chicken and egg thing, but the employees come first.
That's a good answer. I was hoping you could talk about that, because I think people sometimes lose track of the connection between the way employees are treated and the way they treat their customers, the way the customer is treated. Can you talk about
one of the things?
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add to that too. I think there's two ways that a customer connects to a company, and then two ways that an employer or worker connects to the company they work for. There's sort of a functional way. So does everything work the way we want it to work? So, you buy a product, does it work the way it's supposed to? Or you go buy a hamburger at a fast food place, did everything work for you to get that burger? And then there's sort of an emotional feeling you have about that brand and the history you have with the brand and how the brand makes you feel. And inside the company, it's the same thing. And we talked about the candidate experience and the job offer, but how the work is supported day by day by your leader, what kinds of learning and development opportunities, that whole employee experience from the time somebody thinks about you as a place to work till the time through leaving the company, that's the functional part. But then there's an emotional part too, and that's what do we stand for in that big idea.
Well, I'm going to move on to a new area here, and I'm sure that in your experience, since it goes so long and so deep, that technology has been something you've been watching for, 3 decades of HR executive experience. Can you talk about the impact, and generally speaking, technology is helping take culture to a higher, more employee-friendly level? How much impact has have you seen technology, pure technology? We can talk about different aspects of it as well in terms of, whether it's recruiting or whether it's just HR system itself or whether it's, benefits. But what have you seen has been the major advances technology has brought to the table? And you might want to talk about some of the things that have hindered cultural change, too. It's up to you.
Well, first of all, that goes back to that whole functional connection that you make with the employee experience as a company. And so things have to work for you to feel that the culture is there and strong and authentic. But I've always said, the best kind of technology is invisible, because when you feel like the technology is driving the experience, then it doesn't feel so personal. So I feel like having an entire infrastructure, which would include the processes and the programs and the systems that deliver that employee experience, but in an invisible way, in a way that's just easy and intuitive, that's when you're going to have the best kind of cultural alignment. And then there's other tools now that are coming around and much better than they were 30 years ago, which allow you to measure the success of your culture and your employee experience and how people feel about your work day to day. And that's everything from cultural health surveys to employee engagement to pulse surveys. But there's so much good data that you can glean now from the technology that helps you figure out your weak points and where there are gaps and what you need to improve. So I think that there's two sides of that, making it easy to get the employee experience delivered, but also finding out what people think about what you're delivering and what can be improved.
Yeah, and along those lines, I want to ask you about that specifically. You brought up a couple points on analytics, which, analytics is everywhere today. And my question there is, can you discuss some of maybe the ways you personally have used analytics/metrics in your efforts as a CHRO, whether it's Net Promoter or engagement measures, and how do they fit in? I mean, how do you take advantage of those things while you're involved in a cultural transformation?
Well, I think the first thing is you have to think about using the right tool to solve the issue you have. I remember some of my first days at Yahoo, we knew that we were going through a transformation and we were needing to transform some of our culture. And as part of that, we were going to need to change out some of our workplace. We're going to have a layoff, and we're going to have to replace those workers with different types of workers. And so somebody said, it's time for our annual engagement survey. And I said, well, wait a minute. We're going to lay off some people, so why would we want to send a signal that we want to engage them right now? Because that sends the wrong signal. So we decided to have a survey, but we had a survey on the cultural health of the organization and what our values were. What did people think our values were versus what we espoused as our values? So that was the right tool for that right moment. Now, once you have your aspirational culture sort of identified and you know where you're going and you're trying to drive the culture that you want, then you want to go and measure the results of some of your programming. Did that work? What I tried. For example, I was going to try to do a slide. I put the wrong slide up. Okay, there we go. So, for example, if you put in a hiring program for cultural fit, maybe you want to use your data to measure, are the employees we're hiring fitting in the culture? Are they delivering, et cetera? So it just depends on where you are and what you want to measure. But the key is that you're able to measure, and data analytics can help you measure what you need to measure. But be sure you're measuring the right thing so that you can see if your culture is transforming.
Interesting. I mean, there's a lot of focus on technology and analytics, and I know things are getting more and more refined. I guess it's very. How hard is it for HR, from your experience, even today when you deal with HR leaders that you consult with? How hard is it for them to get their heads around the technology aspects of their jobs? Are you seeing changes from the people you work with compared to, say, 15 years ago?
I think most HR people realize how important the technology is to enable everything else they're doing, and in some of the groups that I have been a part of, really kind of looking at the future of HR. Asking questions like, how will machine learning and humans interact? And what will happen when robots come? How will work change? So I think people are savvy to what's out there and savvy to how it might impact us in the future and how it can impact us now. I think one of the biggest challenges for HR always is being able to get the budget to get the technology that we need that really works. Yeah, well, that's always the trick, right? Right. There's so much to pick from, it seems, these days. Yeah. I have two more questions, and then maybe we'll throw it into the Q&A. We have several people here waiting with questions that are pretty good. So the first one I mentioned is they ask is to general advice for HR leaders and professionals when it comes to upping their game regarding culture and engagement. You've talked about a lot of things today, but are there like two or three takeaways you can think of that would sort of cut across no matter what industry you might be in or what type of culture you have? But are there some general things you can talk about that you can impart on our listeners today? Well, it's not going to be just a one-time initiative. You can't just wake up one day and say, we need to change our culture, and then have a company initiative to change the culture, and then say, I'm done. That just can't work. So it has to be an ongoing day in and day out. Every HR program process has to support it. So, and you can't do it all at once. So I think you have to pick what is the most important place to start, and then start with that. So I think defining starting with where are we, a baseline, then where do we have gaps, and then of those gaps, where's the biggest problem? What would move the needle the most if we fixed it? And then define where you'd like to be, and then you can use all of the tools one at a time that support where you'd like to be. So if you find out that you need to change out your workforce, then maybe you start with hiring and leadership development. If you find your employer experience is not living up to the culture that you have espoused, maybe you start with employer branding, and you take each one of those elements of the experience and make it an on-brand experience. Maybe you just haven't done a good job of communicating what's really happening. So maybe you have to do more of an internal storyteller kind of event. Or maybe you have an infrastructure problem. But you've got to pick one place to start and then get that going and then add to it. And it has to be somebody's job, but it's everybody's job. Everybody's got to be part of it. That sounds like good advice. I have another. This is a more specific question for you, and I know you're working with startups and these days and some smaller companies to try to get them up and going. And I'm just curious if there's some specific strategies for the young, smaller companies out there who don't have the resources, obviously, of a large enterprise like a Southwest or a Yahoo or anybody. Are there ways that they can do this? Can they do the same things? Can they make do with less and still achieve the same cultural and performance changes that larger companies can make? I think there's really good news on that front. And a lot of the startups that I have been working with are really thinking about their culture as they start their business. And, back in the day, I used to laugh and say, when Hewlett and Packard were in their garage, they weren't thinking about their corporate culture. But now, today's startups, especially those in the Silicon Valley, they realize how important culture is, and they are thinking about culture and working about culture. So the first thing is most founders are sensitive to it now. The second part is that you're small. So I think the critical part of culture is being able to communicate, tell your story, and align everybody around the story. So when you're small, it's pretty easy to get everybody in one room and talk about it. Now, we've seen some nightmare stories where, the bro culture has, taken people offline, but those stories have, we live in a fishbowl now, so people talk about the mistakes and people are aware of them and want to learn from them. So I think there's some good news there. But the biggest good rule is it doesn't cost a lot to tell your story and to get people in the room to talk about it. That's cheap, and that works.
Yeah. Well, that's it for our questions that I have scripted today. But there's a lot of really good questions from our participants sitting here, and I want to get to some of those. Are you ready to dive into those, Libby?
Sure.
Okay. Let me start with it. I'll go back and do them sort of in chronological. So first people in get the first questions. Here's one from Natalie. We have values of transparency and human capital, but the first one is not applied, whereas the other is partly applied. What can be done? I'm trying to transparency and human capital, but the first one, I guess the transparency part, is not applied, although it's mentioned as a value, I assume what she's saying, and the other is partly applied. What can be done to change that?
Well, I think that you have to confront where you have the gap. I'm not sure what the value around human capital is, but value of transparency means that you're going to be open and transparent, and that people are going to know what's going on with the company. Now, obviously, there's laws and rules about what you can communicate. If you're a publicly traded company, you can't communicate things inside that you're not going to communicate with your shareholders. So you have to make sure that your employees understand what you can and can't communicate and why. I think that's critical. And then we're past the days where you can just spin a story and hope everyone will believe it, because everybody can see what's going on day in, day out. They're online. There's Glassdoor and Facebook and LinkedIn. They can tell the world what's happening inside your company. So I would think that transparency should be the first thing you should tackle, and go in and say, here's where we are, here's where we want to be, and how do we get there? And a lot of that has to do with internal corporate communications, with getting your CEO and your team at the top engaged and really wanting to make improvements there.
Yeah, that's a good answer, I think. Hopefully that Natalie can take that back with her. Here's a second question from Letitia. She clarified her question, so I'm going to ask both parts. Values are internal, behaviors are external. How do you ensure that what you are told by candidates, and values is accurate? Is it fair to determine someone's values in a couple of short interviews? And then the final part of her question is, how do you know you're accurately evaluating somebody's values while they're looking for a job?
Well, I think there's multiple answers to their questions. There are tools that you can use like a test, like not a pen and pencil test, but online test, where you can measure people's values. And it's just kind of some of these tests I've seen them. You just rank, what's the most important thing to you off of a list of values. So some organizations have done that, but in the interview, I would be interviewing for behaviors, and that's when I talk about the behavioral-based interviews. I talk about asking questions on past behavior. So, for example, say being customer-centered is one of your attributes that's going to make someone successful on the job. Well, then you might want to ask them a question like, tell me about the last time you turned an unhappy customer into a happy customer. What was the situation? How did you handle it? And what was the result? In that answer, you're going to clearly see if they're customer-centered, and you're going to see what they did, and you can then find out how they behaved. And so the behavioral part is what you ask for in the interviews. The values you can test for if you want. Some companies do, some don't, but you should certainly make sure they understand what your values are as a company and how they play out.
Okay. That's a good response. Here's one from John. The hardest part to evolve culture is in the quote-unquote frozen middle of the organization. Executives and frontline employees are on board. What advice do you have, Libby, about aligning mid-level leaders to the question just shifted right when I was reading it. To the aspired culture. What advice do you have about aligning mid-level leaders to the aspired culture?
That is really right. That is the hardest part, I think. And I think the most success that I was able to have in my career with that is by really focusing on supervisory development, manager development, and senior management development. So when when I was at Southwest and also when I was at Yahoo, when people were promoted into leadership positions, we really had strong classes about what it meant to be a leader in our organizations, what that behavior looked like, and had people really form their own values-based leadership styles. But we had clearly defined leader behaviors that we needed leaders to have, and we evaluated the people we hired based on those behaviors. But it takes work day in and day out, and then that's where when somebody's off the on-brand behavior, you have to either get them to change or get rid of them. And that's the hardest part.
Yeah, I would imagine it would be, but it's for the good of everyone, right? It almost has to happen or you're not going to get where you want to be. Here's a person writing in who is in the middle of a 3-year culture plan, and I'm going to ask, she asks, how do you staff a culture team, in your view? We're in the midst of designing a 3-year culture plan. We want to ensure we have the right resources dedicated to executing our plan.
Well, I had a slide on that. But anyway,
there you go.
I think you need to have the right people on the team. And so I think that's what she's asking is, who are the right people? And I would say that you need people from every segment of your workforce. And I would very much recommend getting frontline people involved. When I was at Southwest, we had something called the Culture Committee, and it was amazing. We had every segment of the population was invited, and we had about 100 members, and they met 4 times a year. But we actually really started the year with, what are our objectives? And then we let the team set the objectives, and then and they were based on where we had the biggest issues. And then we let the team itself sort of go out and create the solutions. And it's very powerful when a team of a flight attendant, a mechanic, and a pilot implement a program that welcomes and onboards new employees, for example, or that engages the mechanics in a better way. And there's lots of great examples of things we've done, but 2 of my favorites was the mechanics never could go to any company cultural events because they work all night. So we started going to them and having barbecues at 3 in the morning for mechanics and pilots and flight attendants and customer service agent and corporate executives would go cook hamburgers for the mechanics. But it was a way to keep them engaged in the company. Or another example was that flight attendants had to work on holidays. So teams of employees would go in when a plane would pull in and give the flight attendants a snack and a gift and said, relax, we're going to clean the plane for you and help you get the customers loaded so you can have a little break. Merry Christmas or whatever it was. So lots of fun stuff. But this all was generated from inside.
Yeah. That's a very good answer. I hope that answers the person's question. She can bring that back to the team in terms of them designing their 3-year plan. Here's a question for you, very short. You mentioned storytelling. How does storytelling help align around culture?
Well, I think one of the greatest opportunities people have for storytelling is when the company is celebrating an anniversary. And when a company keeps its history alive. And I'll give you one story that this is a story that I couldn't believe, but when I lived in Dallas and I was part of Southwest Airlines, Herb Kelleher brought a fellow CEO to come visit. They have lunch with me. And the CEO said, we just don't have any culture at our company. And his company was about 40 years old. His grandfather had started it. And so I started with him. I said, well, what were your grandfather's values and how did he start the company and what was he trying to accomplish? By the time we finished lunch, we had such a powerful story about his grandfather and why he created the company and what it meant to him and the family and the people who worked there in the early days. And, you forget that the person you hired last week doesn't know all that and doesn't bring that together. And so I think a great opportunity is going back to the inception of the company and figuring out what it stood for when it was created and what it stands for now. And that's where you tell stories. So another great thing, a lot of my great stories are from Southwest, but we did something every month where we took every letter, now I'm sure it would be emails, that a customer wrote in complimenting somebody in the company, and we picked the 20 best ones, and we circulated it to everyone in the company so that people could hear and see and read the stories of this great people who went above and beyond for our employees. And, that is very powerful when people see that, oh, a mechanic stopped and changed somebody's flat tire outside the airport. That's great. I should do something nice like that. Whatever.
It makes a lot of sense. Mm. This is a sort of a related question to something you talked about with the barbecues at 3 in the morning, but there may be other ones. Can you give a good example of an internal communications event that would help people align around culture?
Oh, I can tell you a few, but one of my favorite ones was when I worked at Yahoo, and it's kind of like adversity sort of can become the mother of whatever it is. But I was mixing my metaphors, but we had a Yahoo, we were having a Yahoo problem in that the original person that yodeled, the Yahoo yodel, if anybody remembers it, goes Yahoo, he got paid, just the regular fee for yodeling in a studio, something like less than $1,000 for going in the studio and yodeling a few times. And so all of a sudden this yodel was known all over the world, and so he approached us and said, hey, I have this most famous yodeling in the world, and I think I should get a bigger fee for that yodel than you paid me. Well, we had a contract and for him to yodel, and he yodeled, but how would it look if we sued our yodeler or our yodeler sued us? Not a very good thing. So we decided that we needed to find a way to further employ the yodeler, and how could we have some fun with it? So we had a national yodeling contest in the United States all across the country, and we picked the top yodeler, and we brought the top yodeler plus the new yodeler into our corporate headquarters, and we had a whole event with the yodelers where we broke the Guinness Book of World Records for yodeling, but we just someone just topped it last year, but we held it for many years. And it was so much fun, and it really tapped into our let's not, we want to work things out, we want to have fun, and we yodel kind of part of our culture. It was great.
That's a fantastic story. Not everybody gets to have a yodeling competition as part of their brand. That's pretty interesting. But I do remember that yodel, by the way.
That's the point, though. You have to think of what is special about you. You know, we had that yodel, and when I talked about, this is another funny story, but I talked about having your materials when you offer your branded experience for employees. One of the things I hated at Yahoo was our lawyers would have like a 12-page legal document, you know, with signing away your intellectual property and everything else, confidentiality, and everything you have to do when you hire a knowledge worker in the Silicon Valley. But it was so unfriendly. It's like, congratulations, we're offering you a job. Now sign all this horrible paperwork. So I kept trying to get them to make the letter shorter, and can't we give them the paperwork another time, not when they get the offer? And finally I said, okay, we've got to figure out a way to make this offer part of the employee experience. And so we created this folder. It was kind of like a folder you slip something in and it seals, and it was purple. Then when you open it up, it had all these pictures of Yahoo employees, but it had one of those things like you get in a birthday card with the yodel. So you opened up your offer letter and it went Yahoo, and it showed all the coworkers, and then you could get that paperwork. But it made it at least fun, and that was the goal.
Yeah, that's great. Here's a more functional question. You mentioned surveys and metrics. Can you discuss the cultural survey you used personally, I guess, in your efforts? And did you use a vendor or did you create your own survey?
I used a vendor. The one I used years ago, I don't believe that company. It was a small consulting firm, is still in existence. I know that there are several companies out there that have surveys that measure your cultural health, but I don't know if Workday has one, who's our sponsor, so maybe we should check with them first.
Okay. So in other words, you use a vendor, and you would recommend someone use a vendor because creating your own isn't really an expertise area for most HR people, I would think. I mean,
well, you can create your own, but what I like about a vendor is if they have other clients, then you can also get normative data and compare yourself to norms.
Sure. Here's another one for you. We have a couple more. We're almost running out of time, but this is related to small companies, though, and you touched on it, but if you could expand a little bit. How do you create a positive culture, tough question, when you have an understaffed, overworked supervisory staff, and a low budget? I mean, there may be ways to combat that. Low budgets are always a problem, right?
Yeah, everybody has less of a budget than they wanted. I have never met any HR person that has the budget they need. But if you find that person, let me know. But
okay.
I don't think a lot of this stuff has to cost money, but it does have to be a priority. Yes, your supervisors are overworked and understaffed, but if a priority in their company from the top down, from the bottoms up, if a priority is having a high-performer culture, then that needs to be one of the top things they work on. So it's all about how you look at this. What happens, though, is companies will say, oh, our culture is a priority, but getting this product out on time is more important, so don't focus on culture while you're doing it. Well, no, getting this product out on time while sustaining and maintaining our culture needs to be the priority. And that will change the way you look at a lot of things.
It's interesting. So it really doesn't, not that budget doesn't help, but you can do these things by using innovation and not necessarily having to have the money or spending to get there. You can do things that don't require a lot of spending. That's interesting. I think people, you're right though. Everybody thinks that they're under budget, right? Okay, this could be our last question here. We're running short on time, and the question is related to what you just talked about. And what are the habits of the very best culture role models? I guess that's a general question, but you can think about some of the things that ring a bell for you when it comes to the people you want to be role models when you're trying to improve culture.
Well, I think the first thing is you have to have that culture sort of identified, written down. What is it, and what is the behaviors that will be needed for this culture? And that's kind of a shared mindset that is in the company. Then the role models will lead by example. They will act and behave in a way that is on the brand. And I can't think of anybody better that I ever worked with than Herb Kelleher and Colleen Barrett, the two people who were leading Southwest. But they would say employees first, customers second, and they would live that way. And and they would, but we would also tell great stories about when that happened. And then within your system, your experience for your employees has to be on brand with all those behaviors in mind. And then the leaders have to have those very important attributes and behave in that way. And then there has to be something in it for the employees. But if your CEO, if your team at the top is not behind this and living it every day, then how can you expect anybody else to do it? That's just the bottom line. That's where a lot of it breaks down.
Well, that's a good spot for us to call a close to today's webinar. I hope everyone that participated and called in enjoyed it. And once again, thanks, Libby. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. Thank you.
You're welcome.